Sometimes what we've lost shapes us more than what we find. For 30 years, the town of Cedar Ridge carried the crushing weight of a mystery that cost them everything, a vanished stagecoach that was meant to save them from complete ruin. Jedidiah Moss Thorne was simply tracking a wounded elk through the forbidden elder woods when he stumbled upon something impossible, a moss-covered stagecoach bearing the faded Overland Express crest. Inside lay sealed crates stamped U.S. Mint, hundreds of pristine gold certificates from 1890, the lost fortune meant to rescue the territory from financial panic. What happens when one cowboy's discovery answers the question that haunted an entire generation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun broke over Cedar Ridge like a promise the town had long stopped believing in. Jedidiah Thorne, most folks just called him Moss, stood on the porch of his timber cabin, watching the lights spill across the valley below. He had the weathered look of a man who'd spent more years under open sky than beneath roofs. His face carried lines that mapped out decades of squinting against wind and sun, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who'd never known soft work. He held a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm while he studied the tree line of the elder woods. The forest stretched dark and ancient along the eastern ridge, a place most folks in Cedar Ridge avoided without quite being able to say why. Old superstitions died hard in small towns, and the elder woods had collected more than its share of whispered warnings over the years. Moss reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a tarnished brass compass. The metal was warm from resting against his chest, and the engraving on the back had worn smooth from decades of his thumb running over it. True north lies within. His grandfather had given it to him 60 years ago, back when Cedar Ridge had been a different kind of place, vibrant, hopeful, full of families who believed tomorrow would be better than today. That was before 1890, before the collapse, before the ghost coach became the town's defining mystery. Moss had heard the stories all his life. His grandfather used to tell them on winter evenings, his voice dropping low when he spoke about the Overland Express stagecoach that vanished during a February blizzard. The coach had been carrying emergency relief funds from the federal government, desperately needed money to shore up the territorial bank during the panic that was sweeping across the West. Without it, farms foreclosed, businesses shuttered, and families scattered like leaves before a storm. The coach never arrived. Search parties combed the main routes for weeks, but a late-season blizzard had covered any tracks. Eventually, the railway company declared it lost to the elements, paid out the insurance, and closed the case. The money disappeared into legend, and Cedar Ridge slowly died. 30 years later, the town still bore the scars. Main Street held more empty storefronts than open ones. The bank building stood vacant, its windows dark like the eye sockets of a skull. Young people left as soon as they could, heading to Billings or Denver or anywhere that offered something resembling a future. The population had dwindled from nearly 1,500 at its peak to barely 300 now, most of them folks too old or too stubborn to start over somewhere else. Moss fit into both categories, though he'd never admit to being stubborn. He'd been born in Cedar Ridge, and his wife Sarah had died here 12 years back. She was buried in the cemetery on the hill, under a cottonwood tree they used to sit beneath during courting days. He talked to her sometimes, told her about the deer he tracked or the weather patterns he noticed. It helped ease the quiet. He wasn't lonely, exactly. Solitary suited him, but there was a difference between choosing to be alone and being the last man standing in a ghost town, and some days he couldn't quite tell which side of that line he stood on. Moss. The call came from down the trail, accompanied by the sound of a horse picking its way through the rocky path. Moss looked up to see Sheriff Ben Coulter riding toward the cabin, his bay mare stepping carefully over the uneven ground. Ben was one of the few people Moss could call a true friend. They'd grown up together, gotten into the usual boyhood trouble, and somehow managed to stay close, even as life pulled them in different directions. Ben had married young, had 3 children who'd all left for better opportunities elsewhere, and now wore the sheriff's badge his father had worn before him. "Little early for a social call," Moss said as Ben dismounted. "Something wrong in town?" "Depends on your definition of wrong," Ben replied, tying his horse to the porch rail. He was 56, 2 years younger than Moss, but looked older. The weight of trying to maintain law and order in a dying town had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. "Old man Pritchard is threatening to shoot the Henderson boy's dog again, says it's been getting into his chickens. That dog's been dead for 6 months. I know that. You know that. Pritchard's mind is slipping, but he's still got that rifle." Ben sighed and accepted the cup of coffee Moss poured for him. "Sometimes I think this town is just waiting for the last few of us to give up so it can finally rest." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. 2 men who'd watched their homes slowly fade like a photograph left too long in the sun. "You heading out?" Ben asked, noticing the pack and rifle Moss had prepared. "Wounded elk passed through yesterday evening. Big Bull took a bad fall based on the blood trail. Figure I'll track him, put him out of his misery if he's suffering." "Into the Elder Woods. Trail leads that way." Ben frowned. "You know how folks feel about that place." "Superstition," Moss said, but not unkindly. "Trees are just trees, Ben. Dark and old, sure, but they don't have any special power to curse a man." "Maybe not, but my daddy used to say there were places in this world that hold on to things, memories, maybe, or something else." Said the Elder Woods had weight to them. Moss thought about his grandfather's compass, about how certain objects could carry the past forward. Maybe Ben's father hadn't been entirely wrong, but a wounded animal needed tending to, regardless of what shadows the forest held. "I'll be careful," he said. "Should be back before dark." "Want company?" "Deputy Marsh would probably appreciate you staying in town. Besides, I track better alone. You know that." Ben nodded, set down his empty cup. "Fair enough. You see anything strange out there, though?" "I'll let you know," Moss finished. "Go deal with Pritchard before he gets himself arrested for threatening someone with a ghost dog." Ben managed a small smile at that. "This town gets stranger every year." After the sheriff rode off, Moss gathered his gear and set out. The wounded elk's trail was easy enough to follow, drops of blood on stone, disturbed earth where the animal had stumbled, broken branches where it had pushed through underbrush. The elk was heading east, deeper into territory Moss knew less well. The morning warmed as he walked, though the air carried the crisp edge of early autumn. Leaves were just beginning to turn, splashes of gold and orange among the green. In another few weeks, the high country would be painted in full color, and then the snows would come. This was the time of year Sarah had loved best. She used to say autumn felt like the earth was getting ready to tell its secrets. The trail led him past familiar landmarks at first, a lightning-struck pine that served as a marker, an old trapper's cabin that had collapsed decades ago, a spring that ran clear even in the driest summers. Then he crossed into territory he rarely visited, where the trees grew taller and closer together, their canopy blocking out more of the sky. This was the edge of the Elder Woods proper. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The birdsong grew quieter, the underbrush thickened. Even the quality of light seemed different, filtered through layers of ancient leaves into something green and strange. Moss paused and pulled out his grandfather's compass, more from habit than need. The needle swung and settled, pointing true north, just as it always had. "True north lies within," his grandfather used to say, tapping the engraving. "Means you've got to know your own heart before you can find your way in the world." Wise words, though Moss suspected his grandfather had never been quite as certain about his own heart as he'd pretended to be. The old man had been haunted by the ghost coach story, had spent years trying to make sense of how something so important could simply vanish. He died still wondering, still searching for an answer that would never come, or so Moss had always believed. The elk's trail continued deeper into the woods. Moss followed, his tracking skills honed by decades of practice. He could read the story written in disturbed leaves and broken twigs. The elk was moving slower now, its gait uneven. The blood drops came more frequently. The animal wouldn't last much longer. By midday, Moss had traveled farther into the elder woods than he'd ever been. The forest here felt old in a way that had nothing to do with the age of the trees. It was the kind of place that made you speak in whispers without quite knowing why, where even your footsteps seemed like an intrusion. He stopped for water and a piece of jerky, studying the trail ahead. The elk had turned south, following what looked like an old creek bed, dry now but still visible as a depression in the forest floor. Moss had never seen this particular drainage before. It cut through a narrow ravine, the walls rising steep on either side. Something about the place made him uneasy, though he couldn't have said exactly what. Maybe it was just being this deep in unfamiliar territory. Maybe it was the way the silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through leaves. Or maybe Ben's father had been right, and some places did hold on to things' weight, memory, secrets buried so deep they'd become part of the land itself. Moss touched the compass in his pocket, taking comfort from its familiar shape. Then he started down into the ravine, following the wounded elk's trail toward whatever lay ahead. He had no way of knowing that his grandfather's obsession with the ghost coach hadn't been mere curiosity. He had no way of knowing that family history and town tragedy were about to collide in ways that would change everything. All he knew was that a wounded animal needed finding, and he'd never left a job half done in his life. So Moss walked deeper into the elder woods, toward a discovery that would answer questions 3 decades old and raise new ones that would test everything he believed about justice, duty, and what we owe to the ghosts of the past. The morning sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to the weight of history, waiting to be uncovered in the shadows below. The ravine narrowed as Moss descended, the walls rising higher on either side until only a ribbon of sky remained visible overhead. The elk's blood trail continued along the dry creek bed, but the drops were farther apart now. Either the animal had stopped bleeding or the wound had clotted. Neither option was good. A clotted wound on an elk, this injured usually meant infection was setting in. Moss had tracked for nearly 4 hours when the trail simply stopped. One moment there were clear signs of the elk's passage, and the next, nothing. He crouched down, studying the ground carefully. No blood, no tracks. The animal had either taken flight, which seemed unlikely given its condition, or it had found a way out of the ravine that wasn't immediately obvious. He straightened, scanning the rock walls. There, about 20 yards ahead, a split in the ravine wall, barely wide enough for a man to walk through. The elk must have gone that way. Moss adjusted his pack and squeezed through the gap. On the other side, the world opened up into something he'd never seen before. The ravine widened into a natural bowl, perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by sheer rock walls and thick forest. An ancient rockslide had created this hidden pocket, and trees had grown up around the tumbled stones, creating a canopy so dense that the light beneath took on a greenish, underwater quality. And there, nestled among the trees and half buried in moss and vines, sat a stagecoach. Moss froze. For a long moment he simply stared, his mind struggling to accept what his eyes were showing him. The coach was old, that much was obvious, covered in decades of growth, until it looked more like a natural formation than something built by human hands. Moss had spent half a century in these mountains and had never heard whisper of this place, never seen it marked on any map. He approached slowly, almost reverently. Vines as thick as his wrist had woven through the wheel spokes. Moss grew like velvet carpet across the roof and sides. The wood had weathered to silver grey where it was visible beneath the growth. But even under all that accumulation of years, certain details remained clear. The coach's shape, the style of its construction. And most tellingly, on the driver's door, beneath a coating of moss that Moss carefully brushed away, a brass medallion. The Overland Express crest. His breath caught. The Overland Express, the company that had operated the route through Cedar Ridge, the company whose coach had vanished in 1890. "Lord, have mercy," Moss whispered, and his voice sounded strange in the green silence. He circled the coach slowly, taking in every detail. The vehicle sat at a slight angle, one wheel sunk deeper into the soft earth than the others. The traces and harness were still present, rotted to fragments, but recognizable. No sign of the horses. They'd likely been cut free or had broken away, wandering off to die somewhere else in the woods. And there, still in the driver's seat, slumped against the weathered backrest, sat a skeleton. Moss had seen death enough times not to flinch from it. But something about this particular corpse struck him deep. The man had died alone out here, so close to the main road but hidden by the terrain and the storm, never found by the search parties that had combed the area. He'd sat here for 30 years, while Cedar Ridge slowly died for want of what he'd been carrying. The driver's clothes had mostly rotted away, but fragments remained: the metal buttons from his coat, the buckle from his belt, the leather of his boots, now stiff and cracked. His skull had tilted forward slightly, as if he'd simply fallen asleep at the reins. Moss removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt necessary even if no one was there to see it. "Sorry, friend," he said quietly. "Sorry nobody found you until now." The coach's door was on the side, facing away from the driver's seat. Moss moved to it, his heart beating harder than the climb should have warranted. The hinges had rusted solid, and he had to work at it with his knife, prying and levering until the metal finally gave way with a screech that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. The door swung open. Inside, the coach was surprisingly well preserved. The closed space had protected the interior from the worst of the weather. The seats still held their fabric, though mice had nested in the stuffing. The floor was littered with leaves and debris that had sifted in through gaps in the roof. And stacked from floor to ceiling, filling almost every available space, were wooden crates. Moss's hands trembled slightly as he brushed dirt from the top crate. The wood was stamped with letters burned deep into the grain. U.S. Mint. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Emergency relief funds from the federal government. Desperately needed money to shore up the territorial bank. He used his knife again, this time to pry up the lid of the nearest crate. It resisted, sealed with wax that had hardened over the decades, but eventually gave way. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept them surprisingly dry, were stacks upon stacks of paper. Moss carefully lifted out one bundle and unwrapped it. Gold certificates. U.S. Government gold certificates dated 1890, each one ornately printed, each one representing a specific dollar value backed by gold reserves. He riffled through the stack, counting. Hundreds of them, and there were dozens of bundles in this crate alone. He set the bundle down and simply stood there, breathing hard, trying to process what he was looking at. This was it. This was the lost shipment. The ghost coach wasn't a ghost at all. It was right here, hidden by accident of geography and weather, sitting undiscovered for 3 decades, while Cedar Ridge withered and died. Moss began opening other crates, finding the same contents in each one. Gold certificates, pristine and uncirculated, likely still valid if they could be authenticated. He did rough calculations in his head, multiplying bundle counts by denominations, and the numbers made him dizzy. This wasn't just money. This was a fortune, the kind of fortune that could save a town, or destroy it, depending on who got their hands on it and what they decided to do. He sat down heavily on a boulder, his mind racing. Questions tumbled over each other. Who had legal claim to this? The government that had issued it, the railway company that had insured it, the town it was meant to save? What would happen if he reported this? Would federal authorities swoop in and seize everything, leaving Cedar Ridge with nothing but another layer of disappointment? His grandfather's compass pressed against his chest, and Moss pulled it out, studying the inscription. True north lies within. But what was true north in a situation like this? Legal duty said he should report this immediately to proper authorities. But moral duty, the duty to a town that had suffered for 30 years because this money never arrived, said something different. Moss had never been a dishonest man. He paid his debts, kept his word, and followed the law as best he understood it. But he'd also seen what the government's abandonment had done to Cedar Ridge. The perfunctory search that had given up after 2 weeks. The insurance payout that had satisfied the railway company but done nothing for the families who'd lost their farms, their businesses, their futures. The driver had died trying to deliver this money. It had been 3 miles from the main road, that was all. 3 miles, and a heart that had given out at the worst possible time. If the horses had kept going instead of stopping, if the blizzard had held off for 1 more day, if any of 100 small things had gone differently, this money would have reached Cedar Ridge. The bank would have been saved. The town would have survived. Would have. Should have. 30 years of conditional tenses, of roads not taken, of rescue that never came. Moss stood up slowly, his decision made even if he didn't fully understand all its implications yet. He needed to tell someone, but it had to be someone he could trust, someone who understood what this meant, who could help him navigate the impossible maze of legal and moral questions this discovery raised. He needed to tell Ben. Moss took one more long look at the stagecoach, at the crates of certificates, at the driver's skeleton still keeping watch after all these years. Then he carefully marked the location in his mind, noting landmarks that would let him find his way back. He studied the ravine walls, memorizing the path he'd need to take. As he turned to leave, something made him look back one more time. The stagecoach sat there in its bower of moss and thyme, looking like something from a dream or a ghost story. The ghost coach of Cedar Ridge, hidden where no one would think to look, carrying salvation that had come 30 years too late. Unless, and this was the thought that Moss carried with him as he made his way out of the hidden bowl and back through the narrow gap in the ravine wall, unless it wasn't too late after all. The sun was past its peak when Moss emerged from the ravine. He'd lost the wounded elk, but he'd found something far more important, something that could change everything, if he could figure out the right way to handle it. He set his course for town, walking fast, his mind already working through how to tell Ben what he'd found. Behind him, the elder woods held their secret close, the way they'd held it for 30 years, but not anymore. The ghost coach had been found, and whatever came next, Cedar Ridge would finally get the answer to the question that had haunted them for a generation. The only question now was whether that answer would save them or tear them apart. The ride back to Cedar Ridge took half the time Moss had spent tracking into the elder woods. He pushed himself hard, urgency driving him forward even as his mind wrestled with the weight of what he'd discovered. By the time the town's few remaining buildings came into view, the sun was settling toward the western horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and gold that made Cedar Ridge look almost beautiful, almost like it might have been before the collapse. The sheriff's office sat on Main Street, a small stone building that had weathered the decades better than its wooden neighbors. A lamp already burned in the window. Ben worked late most evenings, probably because going home to an empty house held no particular appeal. All 3 of his children had moved away years ago, and his wife had passed from influenza the winter before last. Moss tied his horse and pushed through the door without knocking. Ben looked up from the paperwork spread across his desk, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern when he saw Moss's face. "What happened?" Ben asked, standing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Close enough," Moss said. He glanced around the office, confirming they were alone. "Is Tom around?" "Deputy Marsh is checking the perimeter. Won't be back for at least an hour." Ben came around the desk. "Moss, you're white as a sheet. Sit down before you fall down." "I'm not going to fall down," but Moss sat anyway, suddenly aware of how tired he was, how much nervous energy had carried him through the past few hours. "Ben, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen until I'm done." Don't interrupt, don't ask questions, just hear me out. Ben's concern deepened, but he nodded and took the chair opposite Moss. All right, I'm listening. So Moss told him. He started with tracking the wounded elk, moved through entering the hidden bowl in the ravine, and described in careful detail what he'd found there. Ben's expression shifted through disbelief, confusion, and finally something that looked like stunned wonder. When Moss finished, silence filled the office. Outside, someone's dog barked. A wagon rattled past on the street. Normal sounds from a normal evening in a town that had just stopped being normal, if it ever had been. "The ghost coach," Ben finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You actually found it." "I found it. And the money. Still there. Crates full of gold certificates from 1890. I don't know if they're still valid. Don't know what they're worth in today's terms, but Ben, there's enough there to change everything." Ben stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening street. Moss waited, watching his friend process the impossible news. Ben was methodical by nature, the kind of man who thought things through from every angle before making decisions. It was what made him a good sheriff, and what would make him a valuable ally in whatever came next. "My father looked for that coach," Ben said quietly. "Did I ever tell you that?" "You mentioned it once or twice. He was a deputy back then, during the search. I was just a boy, maybe 6 years old. I remember him coming home exhausted every night, covered in mud and snow, and my mother asking if they'd found anything." Ben shook his head slowly. "They searched for 2 weeks. My father wanted to keep going, but the railway company called it off. Said the coach was lost, the driver probably dead, the money gone. They paid out the insurance and moved on." "But your father didn't move on." "No. He kept searching on his own time, whenever he could. Rode out into the mountains, checked every ravine and hollow he could find. It ate at him. Moss. He felt like he'd failed the town, failed all those families who'd lost everything when the bank collapsed." Ben turned from the window, and his eyes were wet. He died 10 years later, still believing he'd let everyone down. Moss had known Sheriff Coulter Sr., had respected the man's dedication. Learning that he'd carried that burden for a decade, never knowing how close he'd probably come to the actual location, made Moss's chest ache. Ben walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. He pulled out a dented tin star, tarnished with age. This was his badge, kept it all these years. "Sometimes I take it out and wonder if I'm living up to what he tried to do for this town." He looked at Moss. "If we found that money, if we could actually use it to help Cedar Ridge, it would mean everything he did wasn't for nothing." "That's what I was thinking on the ride back," Moss admitted. "But Ben, there are problems, legal problems. Who actually owns that money now? The government issued it. The railway insured it. Does it belong to them? To the town? And if we report it to federal authorities, what's to stop them from seizing everything and leaving us with nothing but paperwork?" Ben set his father's badge on the desk, studying it. "After 30 years, there are probably statutes of limitation that apply, abandoned property laws maybe. But I'm not a lawyer, and this is bigger than anything Cedar Ridge has dealt with in my lifetime. We need to be smart about this." "Agreed. But Moss," Ben met his eyes directly, "we also need to be honest. If we try to hide this, try to claim it without proper legal channels, we could end up in prison, or worse, we could tear this town apart fighting over it." "I know." Moss pulled out his grandfather's compass, turned it over in his hands. "That's why I came to you first. I needed someone I could trust, someone who'd help me figure out the right way to handle this." "The right way," Ben repeated. "That's the question, isn't it? What's right when the government abandoned us 30 years ago, when they sent relief that never arrived and then just moved on, when families starved and businesses collapsed and people died, and nobody in Washington or anywhere else seemed to care?" The bitterness in Ben's voice was unusual. He was typically even-tempered, measured in his judgments. But this touched something deep, some old wound that Cedar Ridge's slow death had carved into everyone who'd stayed. "We need to verify it first." Moss said. Make sure those certificates are actually what they appear to be, that they're still valid. Then we need to research the legal situation, quietly, before we tell anyone else. Agreed. We go back tomorrow. Document everything carefully. I'll bring my camera, photograph the scene. We need a record of exactly how we found it, in case questions come up later. And then? Then we talk to Doc Harlon. Ben saw Moss's surprise and explained, he's the oldest person left in Cedar Ridge. He was here during the collapse, remembers it firsthand. If anyone has perspective on what this means, it's him. Plus, he's got legal knowledge from his years serving on the town council. We'll need his counsel. Moss nodded slowly. Doc Harlon was a good choice, sharp-minded despite his age, and someone else they could trust absolutely. We keep this between the three of us for now, Ben continued. No one else, not even Tom, much as I trust him. The fewer people who know, the less chance word spreads before we're ready. Agreed. Ben looked at his father's badge again, then carefully returned it to the drawer. You realize this could change everything? If we can actually claim that money legitimately, if we can use it to rebuild, Cedar Ridge could have a future again. Or it could tear us apart fighting over it, Moss said quietly. Money changes people, even good people, especially when there's enough of it. That's why we have to do this right. Document everything, follow proper legal channels, set up some kind of trust or system that benefits everyone fairly. Ben managed a tired smile. Though, I'll admit, the thought of seeing new businesses open on Main Street, of young families moving back, I know. I thought about that too. Moss stood, his body reminding him of the long day's walk. Tomorrow morning then, early, dawn, meet here, and we'll ride out together. As Moss turned to leave, Ben called his name. Thank you for trusting me with this. I know it couldn't have been an easy decision. You're my friend, Moss said simply. Have been since we were boys. If I can't trust you with something this important, I can't trust anyone. After Moss left, Ben sat alone in his office for a long time, staring at the drawer that held his father's badge. Tomorrow, they'd go see the ghost coach for themselves. Tomorrow, they'd start down a path that would either save Cedar Ridge or destroy what little remained of it. The lamp burned low, casting shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts of decisions yet to be made. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of autumn morning where your breath misted in the air and frost silvered the grass. Moss arrived at the sheriff's office to find Ben already preparing his horse, a bulky camera box strapped carefully to his saddle, along with rope, a lantern, and other supplies they might need. They rode in companionable silence, both men lost in their own thoughts. The elder woods looked different in morning light, less forbidding perhaps, though no less ancient. Ben studied the forest with the careful attention of someone cataloguing details for future reference, and Moss noticed his friend's hand occasionally drift to the notebook tucked in his vest pocket. Never been this deep into the elder woods, Ben admitted as they navigated the narrowing ravine, starting to understand why nobody found it. This terrain, you could ride past that gap in the wall 100 times and never notice it. That's exactly what happened, Moss said. Search parties probably came within 50 yards and never saw it. The blizzard would have covered any tracks the coach made turning in here, and once it was hidden, he didn't need to finish. They both understood how landscape and weather and simple bad luck could conspire to hide something in plain sight for 3 decades. When they squeezed through the gap and the hidden bowl opened before them, Ben simply stopped and stared. Moss watched his friend take in the scene, the impossible coach wrapped in moss and vines, the skeleton in the driver's seat, the sense of time suspended that hung over the place like morning mist. "Lord, have mercy," Ben breathed, and Moss recognized the same prayer of disbelief he'd offered the day before. They approached slowly. Ben circled the coach twice, examining it from every angle, before carefully setting up his camera equipment. The photographs would be crucial evidence, proof of how they'd found everything, but Ben worked with deliberate care, making sure each shot was properly framed and focused. While Ben photographed the exterior, Moss opened the door again. The hinges protested less this time, as if accepting the inevitability of being disturbed. The stacked crates looked exactly as he'd left them, and in daylight, filtering through gaps in the canopy, he could see details he'd missed before. "The seal," Ben said, leaning in to examine the top crate. His finger traced the wax seal without touching it. "Treasury Department, unbroken after all these years. Moss, this is—" "I know." Ben photographed the seal from multiple angles, then helped Moss carefully pry open the crate. Inside, the bundles of gold certificates lay pristine in their oiled cloth wrapping. Ben handled one with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. "These are real," he said softly. 1890, just like the story always said. "Moss, this is the proof. This is the actual relief shipment." "We need to check the driver," Moss said quietly. "See if there's any identification, anything that tells us what happened." They approached the skeleton with respect bordering on ceremony. Ben photographed the remains in position before they carefully searched the driver's clothing. The coat, though rotted and faded, had protected its contents surprisingly well. In the inside pocket, they found a leather wallet. The identification papers were barely legible, but they could make out enough. Nathaniel Briggs, age 47, employed by Overland Express Company. There was a photograph too, water-stained and faded, but still showing a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a full beard. "Poor fellow," Ben murmured. "Died trying to do his job. Never knew how close he came." But the real discoveries were in the other pocket. First, a folded manifest detailing the shipment. 42 crates of gold certificates totaling Moss and Ben stared at the figure $250,000 in 1890 currency. The manifest listed the destination clearly: Cedar Ridge Territorial Bank, emergency relief authorization from the U.S. Treasury. And second, a small journal bound in oiled leather that had kept the pages readable despite the decades. Ben opened it carefully. The entries were brief, written in a clear hand that grew shakier toward the end. Most were routine notes about the journey, weather conditions, stops made. But the final entries told the story they'd been missing for 30 years. "February 17th, Ben read aloud. "Feeling poorly today, chest pains worse than yesterday, pulled off main road to rest. Will continue to Cedar Ridge once feeling passes." The next entry was harder to read, the handwriting uneven. "Can barely breathe. Pain terrible. Horses restless. Tried to continue but too weak. Pray someone finds shipment. Town needs it. Tell my wife I tried." There was one final line, almost illegible. "So sorry." The words hung in the air between them. Moss felt a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with the climb. Nathaniel Briggs had died knowing he'd failed, knowing the relief money he carried would never reach its destination. He'd died alone and afraid. 3 miles from the road, and nobody had found him until it was 30 years too late to matter. Except maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe, somehow, his death could still mean something. Ben closed the journal carefully and set it aside. They worked in silence for the next hour, documenting everything. They counted crates 42, just as the manifest stated. They opened several more, confirming identical contents. They photographed the manifest, the journal, the wax seals. Finally, Ben pulled out his notebook and began calculating. If these certificates are still valid, and if the government honored them at face value, he paused, checking his math. Moss, even accounting for inflation and currency changes, we're looking at the equivalent of several $1 million in today's money. Enough to save a town. Enough to save 10 towns. Ben looked around the hidden bowl, at the coach that had sat here undiscovered for 3 decades, while Cedar Ridge slowly died. The question is whether we have any legal right to it. The government sent it to save Cedar Ridge, Moss said. It never arrived because the driver had a heart attack and the search was called off too soon. Seems to me the intent was clear. This money belonged to our town. Still does. That's one argument. But legally, Ben shook his head, The Treasury Department might say it's still federal property. The railway company might claim it under salvage rights. We need legal counsel, Moss. Real counsel, not just our best guess. Doc Harlon. Doc Harlon, Ben agreed. He practiced law before he became a doctor, back in the territorial days. If anyone can guide us through the legal maze, it's him. They resealed the crates they'd opened, returned Nathaniel Briggs's wallet and journal to his coat, with a murmured apology for the disturbance. Ben took a few final photographs, capturing the overall scene from different angles. As they prepared to leave, Moss took one long look at the ghost coach. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like tragedy wrapped in moss and time, like good intentions that had died 3 miles short of their destination. But maybe good intentions didn't have to stay dead. Maybe, after 30 years, they could be resurrected. "Tonight," Ben said as they made their way back through the gap in the ravine wall, "we talk to Doc tonight. The 3 of us work out what to do next. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we pray nobody else stumbles onto this place." Ben glanced back at the hidden bowl. "And we pray we're doing the right thing." Moss touched his grandfather's compass through his vest. "True north lies within," the old man used to say. But what was true north when the path forward led through territory no map had ever charted? They rode back to Cedar Ridge as the sun climbed higher, 2 men carrying the weight of a discovery that could change everything. Behind them, the elder woods held their secret close, the ghost coach sitting in its bower of moss and memory, waiting to see if 30 years of patience would finally be rewarded with purpose. Doc Harlon lived in a small house at the edge of town, a structure that had weathered the years with the same stubborn persistence as its owner. At 85, Doc was the oldest resident of Cedar Ridge, a man whose sharp mind had outlasted his body's decline. He still kept office hours twice a week, though most of his patients now were old friends seeking company as much as medical care. Moss and Ben arrived just after sunset, when the last light was fading from the western sky. Doc answered the door himself, leaning on his cane, his roomy eyes bright with curiosity. "Evening, gentlemen. This isn't a social call, I take it?" "No, Doc," Ben said quietly. "We need to talk to you about something important, something that needs to stay between the 3 of us." Doc studied them for a long moment, then nodded and stepped aside. "Come in, then. I'll put on coffee. Something tells me this is going to be a long conversation." They settled in Doc's study, a room lined with medical texts and territorial law books from his years practicing both professions. Doc poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly but never spilled a drop, then lowered himself into his chair with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to respect his joints. "All right," he said. "What's this about?" Moss and Ben exchanged glances, and then Moss began the story for the second time. He watched Doc's face as he spoke, saw disbelief give way to wonder, and wonder give way to something deeper and more complicated, a mixture of grief and vindication that made the old man's eyes glisten with unshed tears. When Moss finished, Doc sat in profound silence. He stared at nothing in particular, his coffee forgotten in his hands. Finally, he set down the cup and rose, moving to a bookshelf with surprising purpose. "I kept a ledger," he said, pulling down a weathered volume bound in cracked leather. "Started it when I opened my practice in 1887. Recorded every patient, every treatment, His voice caught. "Every death." He returned to his chair and opened the ledger, turning pages with careful reverence until he found what he was looking for. The pages for early 1890 were dense with entries, the handwriting cramped as if he'd been trying to fit too much suffering onto too little paper. "February through April, 1890, Doc said quietly. "The collapse, the waiting, the slow death of hope." He began to read, his voice steady despite the tears now running freely down his weathered cheeks. "February 23rd, Mary Henderson, age 7. Malnutrition, parents lost their farm, couldn't afford food, died at home." He turned a page. "March 5th, Thomas Chen, age 52, took his own life after bank foreclosed on his business, left a wife and 4 children. Moss felt his throat tighten. Ben had gone very still. March 19th. Samuel and Elizabeth Cooper, ages 3 and 5, pneumonia. Could have been treated, but family had no money for medicine after the bank collapse. Doc looked up from the ledger. Do you want me to continue? I have 3 pages of entries like this. Preventable deaths, families destroyed, all because the relief money never arrived. Doc, Ben started, but the old man raised a hand. My father ran the general store on Main Street. Good man, honest businessman. When the bank collapsed, he extended credit to half the town, figured they'd pay when things got better. Doc's laugh was bitter. Things never got better. He lost everything trying to help people, had to close the store, sell our house. We moved to a 1-room cabin on the edge of town. He died of pneumonia the next winter, but really he died of heartbreak. Died knowing he'd failed everyone who'd trusted him. The weight of that history filled the room like a physical presence. Moss thought about his own grandfather, about Sheriff Coulter's father, about all the people who'd carried the burden of the town's failure. The government sent that money, Doc continued, his voice hardening. They promised relief. People waited, hoped, held on because they believed help was coming. And when it didn't arrive, when the coach was declared lost and the case closed, nobody came to check on us. Nobody asked if we were all right. They just moved on. Like we didn't matter. Like 30 families starving in a territorial town was just the cost of doing business. That's why we came to you, Moss said quietly. We need to know legally, morally, what's right here. Doc closed the ledger and set it on his lap, his hands resting on its cover like he was swearing an oath. Legally, it's complicated. That money was federal property, sent to the territorial bank through official channels, but the territory became a state years ago, and there are questions about whether the federal government maintained any ongoing claim to lost property. What about the railway company? Ben asked. They insured the shipment. They paid out the insurance in 1890. I remember, because it was a point of controversy, they compensated themselves for the lost coach and cargo, but never offered anything to the town that was meant to receive it. Doc shook his head. If they were paid for the loss, their claim is probably settled. So it's possible, Moss said carefully, that after 30 years, with the railway compensated and the federal government having made no effort to recover it, it's possible that abandoned property laws could apply, Doc finished, especially if we can demonstrate that the money was intended for the specific benefit of Cedar Ridge residents and was lost through no fault of the town. Would that hold up in court? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer anymore, haven't been for 40 years, but I know enough to say this. We need to research the hell out of it before we make any moves. Doc leaned forward. If we try to claim this and we're wrong, we could face federal charges. If we report it and let the government seize it, Cedar Ridge gets nothing. Again. So what do we do? Ben asked. We build a case, Doc said firmly. I'll research territorial law, look for precedents about abandoned government property. Ben, you're the sheriff, you have access to railway company records through law enforcement channels. See what you can find about the insurance settlement, any ongoing claims. Moss, you guard that site. Make sure nobody else discovers it before we're ready. How long? Moss asked. Give me 3 days. I'll go through the county archives, consult some old law books I still have. We meet back here in 3 days and compare what we've learned. Ben nodded slowly. And if we find a legal path forward? Then we take it, carefully and by the book. We authenticate those certificates through proper channels, establish a trust for the town's benefit, and do everything so transparently that nobody can question our motives. Doc picked up his ledger again, holding it like evidence. This town deserves that money. Those people who died deserve that money. If there's a legal way to claim it, we have a moral obligation to try. And if there isn't a legal way? Moss asked quietly. Doc met his eyes. Then we have a harder decision to make, But one thing I know for certain, the government that abandoned us doesn't get to swoop in now and take what was meant to save us. Not while I'm still breathing." They talked for another hour, working out details of their separate research tasks, agreeing on communication protocols to keep their investigation quiet. When Moss and Ben finally left, stepping out into a night grown cold and starbright, they carried the weight of conspiracy on their shoulders, not to steal, but to reclaim what had been promised and never delivered. Doc stood in his doorway, watching them go. The ledger was still in his hands, its pages heavy with the names of the dead. After 30 years, those names might finally mean something more than tragedy. They might mean justice. He closed the door and returned to his study, already reaching for the law books that held the answers they needed. The next 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Moss spent most of his time in the elder woods, camping near the hidden bowl where the ghost coach sat undisturbed. He told himself he was protecting the site, making sure no one else stumbled upon it, but really he was trying to come to terms with what the discovery meant. He'd been a simple man all his life. He tracked game, tended his small plot of land, and lived quietly on the edge of a dying town. Now he found himself at the center of something that could change everything, and the weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. On the afternoon of the second day, he heard someone approaching through the forest. Moss recognized the footfalls before he saw the man, Deputy Tom Marsh, young and earnest, picking his way through the underbrush with the careful steps of someone who wasn't entirely comfortable in deep wilderness. "Moss," Tom called out. "You out here?" Moss emerged from behind a boulder, making Tom jump. "Easy there, Deputy." "Just me." Tom pressed a hand to his chest, breathing hard. "Lord, you move quiet for a man your age. Been tracking a deer that came through here yesterday. Saw your camp and figured I'd check in." He glanced around, curiosity evident in his expression. "This is pretty deep into the elder woods. You been out here a while?" "Couple days. Doing some scouting." "For what?" "Deer sign. Planning next month's hunt." The lie came easier than Moss liked, but Tom didn't seem to notice anything amiss. "Sheriff's been acting strange," Tom said, settling onto a fallen log without being invited. "Spending a lot of time in his office with the door closed, riding out to the county seat on business he won't explain. And Doc Harlon's been holed up in his study, won't see patients." He looked at Moss directly. "People are starting to talk, wondering if something's going on. People always talk in small towns, usually about nothing." "Maybe," Tom didn't sound convinced. "But when the sheriff, the town's best tracker, and the oldest doctor all start acting mysterious at the same time, well, it makes folks curious." Moss felt a stirring of concern. If rumors were already spreading, word might reach beyond Cedar Ridge. The last thing they needed was outside attention before they'd figured out the legal situation. "Whatever Ben's working on, I'm sure he'll share it when he's ready," Moss said carefully. "Man's entitled to privacy in his work." Tom studied him for a moment longer, then nodded and stood. "Suppose you're right. Well, if you see that deer, it's a 6-point buck, bit of a limp in his front left leg. Probably took a bad step somewhere. I'll keep an eye out." After Tom left, Moss sat for a long time thinking about rumors and secrets, and how quickly things could spiral beyond control. They needed to move faster. While Moss kept watch in the woods, Ben was making discoveries of his own. The county archives held more than he'd expected about the ghost coach incident, including a full file of correspondence between the Overland Express company and various federal authorities. Sitting in the dusty records room, Ben had read through letter after letter, his anger building with each page. The search for the missing coach had been perfunctory at best. 2 weeks of half-hearted effort, then a quick declaration that the coach had been lost to severe weather conditions and likely destroyed. The railway company had filed an insurance claim immediately, citing acts of God as cause for the loss. Most damningly, Ben found letters from Cedar Ridge's mayor at the time, begging the company to continue searching, explaining the desperate need for the relief funds. The responses had been bureaucratic and cold. Claim settled, case closed, no further action warranted. Ben photographed the most relevant documents, his hands trembling with suppressed fury. The government and the railway company had abandoned Cedar Ridge without a second thought. They'd taken their insurance payout and moved on, leaving an entire town to wither and die. Meanwhile, Doc Harlon had been conducting his own research in the territorial law books that lined his study. What he found was encouraging, if complicated. There were precedents for abandoned property reverting to local jurisdiction, particularly in cases where federal property had been lost in territories that later became states. More intriguingly, he'd discovered cases where government funds specifically designated for relief purposes had been ruled to belong to the intended beneficiaries rather than to the issuing agency, particularly when the failure to deliver had been due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a foundation they could build on. On the evening of the third day, they gathered again in Doc's study. Each man shared what he'd learned, spreading documents and notes across Doc's large oak desk. The railway company got paid, Ben said, his voice tight with controlled anger. $48,000 in insurance money, paid out in March of 1890. They wrote off the coach, the cargo, everything, and collected their compensation. Then they closed the case and never looked back. Which means they have no ongoing claim, Doc said, making notes. They were made whole. And the federal government? Moss asked. That's where it gets interesting. Doc pulled out a law book, marked with several pieces of paper. I found 3 cases, 2 from New Mexico Territory and 1 from Montana, where government property specifically designated for local relief was ruled to belong to the intended recipients, even after extended delays in delivery. The reasoning was that the funds had been allocated with specific intent, and that intent didn't evaporate just because delivery failed. Would that apply to gold certificates? Ben asked. Potentially. The certificates themselves are government property, but they were sent with the specific purpose of providing emergency relief to Cedar Ridge's bank. The manifest we found supports that intent. The question is whether 30 years changes the legal calculus. Moss leaned back in his chair. So we might have a legitimate claim. We might, Doc agreed cautiously, but we'd need to establish it carefully, document everything, work through proper legal channels, authenticate the certificates to prove they're genuine. Which brings us to the problem, Ben said. The moment we start trying to authenticate $250,000 in gold certificates, we're going to attract attention, federal attention. And if the wrong people catch wind of this before we've established our legal standing, they could seize everything, Doc finished. Claim it's still federal property, tie it up in courts for years, and Cedar Ridge gets nothing. So what do we do? Moss asked. Doc was quiet for a moment, thinking. We need to authenticate at least one certificate, prove they're real and still redeemable, but we need to do it discreetly, through private banking channels rather than government ones. I have a contact in Kansas City, a banker I knew from my territorial council days. He's trustworthy and knows how to handle sensitive matters. One certificate, Ben said. If it's authentic and redeemable, we know the rest likely are too. Then we move to establish legal claim before publicly revealing the full extent of the discovery, Doc continued. Set up a trust, file the proper paperwork, build our case based on the precedents I've found. And if someone questions our claim, Moss asked, then we have the historical records, the manifest, the journal, everything documented and photographed. We have the legal precedents, and we have the moral argument that this money was meant to save Cedar Ridge, and the government's failure to deliver it destroyed lives. Ben spread out the railway correspondence on the desk. These letters show they gave up after 2 weeks, barely tried. My father searched for years, and he was just one deputy working alone. If they'd put real resources into finding it. But they didn't, Doc said firmly. They took the easy way out, collected their insurance, and left us to die. Well, we didn't die. We're still here. And if there's a legal path to claim what was always meant to be ours, then by God, we're going to take it. They spent another hour refining their plan. Moss would transport a single certificate to Kansas City with Doc. Ben would prepare the legal documentation they'd need. And all of them would pray that their secret held long enough to see it through. As Moss prepared to leave, Doc called him back. The risk here is real, you know. If this goes wrong, we could lose everything: reputation, freedom, the town's last chance at salvation. Are you certain you want to proceed? Moss thought about his grandfather, who died wondering about the ghost coach, about Ben's father, who died believing he'd failed, about all the families in Doc's ledger who died waiting for help that never came. I'm certain, he said, this is the right thing to do, even if it means bending some rules, moving faster than cautious men might advise. Even then, Doc nodded slowly. Good, because tomorrow we stop researching and start acting. Tomorrow we find out if 30 years of patience can finally be rewarded with justice. Moss returned to the ghost coach one final time before the journey to Kansas City. He wanted to select the certificate they'd take for authentication carefully, wanted to make sure they'd documented everything properly. But mostly, if he was honest with himself, he wanted to say goodbye to Nathaniel Briggs, the driver who died trying to complete his mission. The hidden bowl was peaceful in the afternoon light. Birds called from the surrounding trees, and a soft breeze stirred the leaves. Moss worked methodically, checking each crate one more time, comparing the contents against the manifest they'd photographed. He was on his knees beside the coach, carefully rewrapping a bundle of certificates, when his hand brushed against something odd in the coach's floorboards. A section of wood moved slightly under his touch, loose when everything else had been solid. Moss paused, frowning. He pressed the board again, felt it give. Using his knife, he carefully pried up the section of floor. Beneath it, in a hollow that looked deliberately carved, lay a small canvas bag. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled it out. The bag was oiled cloth, similar to what had protected the certificates, designed to keep its contents dry. Moss loosened the drawstring and emptied the bag onto the coach floor. A badge tumbled out first. Not the driver's badge they'd found on Nathaniel Briggs, but a security escort badge. The metal was tarnished but still readable. Samuel Garrett, Federal Security Escort. Moss stared at the name. Garrett, his grandfather's family name, his own family name, passed down through the male line for generations. There were other items in the bag: a small leather-bound notebook, a few personal effects, and what looked like letters tied with twine. Moss's heart pounded as he picked up the notebook with shaking hands. On the first page, written in a neat, controlled hand, was a name and date. Samuel T. Garrett, February 1890. If found, please deliver to my brother Jacob Garrett, Cedar Ridge. Jacob Garrett, Moss's grandfather. The world seemed to tilt. Moss sat back heavily against the coach wheel, his mind racing. His grandfather had never mentioned having a brother. Never. In all the years of telling stories about the ghost coach, about the tragedy of its disappearance, he'd never once said that his own brother might have been involved. With trembling hands, Moss opened the notebook and began to read. The early entries were routine notes about the journey, travel conditions, meals eaten. Samuel Garrett had been assigned as secret security for the shipment, an escort riding inside the coach to guard against robbery. His presence had been kept confidential to avoid attracting attention to the valuable cargo. But the later entries told a different story, one that made Moss's chest tighten with each page. February 17th. Nathaniel is not well. I've known him for years. Know he has a weak heart. He should not have taken this assignment, but he needed the money. Told me his wife is with child. They have medical debts. I tried to convince him to turn back, but he insisted we press on. Cedar Ridge is close now. He wants to finish the job. February 18th. Nathaniel collapsed this morning. Heart attack, I'm certain. Did everything I could, but he died within the hour. I buried him as best I could beneath the driver's seat, couldn't spare time for proper burial with the money at risk. Tried to drive the coach myself, but I'm no teamster. The horses spooked in the ravine, and one of the wheels broke when we turned too sharp. The coach is stuck, and I cannot move it alone. Moss's hands were shaking so hard now that he could barely turn the pages. The next entry was dated 2 days later. Have been trying to repair the wheel, but it's beyond my skill. The blizzard is getting worse. I could walk to Cedar Ridge, it's only a few miles, but if I leave the money unguarded and something happens, I'll be blamed. They'll say I stole it, or abandoned my post. My brother Jacob is in Cedar Ridge, but I cannot involve him in this. Cannot let him be connected to what will look like my failure. The next page made everything clear, and made everything so much worse. I have made a decision I pray is the right one. I will hide the coach deeper in the ravine, conceal it from casual discovery. When the blizzard passes, I will make my way to the railway office in Billings, report the accident, lead a proper recovery team back to retrieve the shipment. This way, the money stays protected. I stay with my post, and no one can accuse me of abandonment or theft. It's only a few days' delay. The town will get their relief, just slightly later than planned. But there were no more entries after that. The rest of the notebook's pages were blank. Moss set down the notebook and picked up the letters with numb fingers. They were sealed envelopes, addressed but never sent. One was to Samuel's wife, another to the railway company, and the third was to Jacob Garrett Moss's grandfather. He opened his grandfather's letter with hands that had forgotten how to be steady. "Dear Jacob," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have failed to return from the Elder Woods, and someone has finally found the ghost coach. I want you to know that I tried to do the right thing. I tried to protect the money our town so desperately needs, but I see now that my plan was flawed, that my pride and fear of blame led me to make choices that may have doomed Cedar Ridge." The letter went on to explain everything: Nathaniel's death, Samuel's decision to hide the coach, his plan to retrieve it after the storm. It ended with words that seemed to reach across 30 years. "I know the town will suffer while they wait for relief that does not come. I know they will curse the ghost coach and the driver who failed them. Let them curse me, Jacob. I deserve it. But know that I loved our town, loved you and your family, and wanted only to serve with honor. If I have failed in that, may God and Cedar Ridge forgive me. Tell Mother I was thinking of her. And please, brother, do not let my failure stain your name. You were always the better man. S.G." Moss sat in stunned silence, the letter gripped in his hands. His grandfather's brother, the ghost coach's secret guardian, the man who'd made a fateful decision out of fear and pride, who'd planned to fix everything and never got the chance. Now other pieces fell into place. His grandfather's obsession with the ghost coach story, the way he'd always spoken about it with a particular kind of intensity, as if it were personal rather than just local tragedy. He must have received word that his brother had vanished, must have spent years wondering what had happened, never knowing that Samuel had died, trying to protect money meant to save the very town they both called home. Moss looked at the driver's seat where they'd found Nathaniel Briggs. According to Samuel's notebook, he'd buried the driver beneath that very spot, but the body had worked its way back up over the decades. And Samuel himself, Moss, scanned the area, his tracker's eyes looking for any sign of where his great-uncle might have fallen. He found the answer 20 yards from the coach, in a small depression that might once have been a temporary camp. Barely visible beneath decades of leaf litter and moss were bones, and next to them the rusted remains of a rifle and what looked like camping gear. Samuel Garrett had died, trying to protect the shipment. Maybe from exposure, maybe from the same heart condition that had killed Nathaniel Briggs. They'd been family, friends, after all, and such conditions often ran in families. He'd died here, alone, his plan to retrieve the coach dying with him. Moss stood over his great-uncle's remains, his emotions a tangle of grief, anger, and strange understanding. Samuel Garrett had made a choice based on fear, fear of being blamed, fear of failing his duty, fear of dishonoring his family name. That choice had kept the money hidden for 3 decades, had contributed to Cedar Ridge's collapse, and had haunted his brother for the rest of his life. But it had also been a choice made with good intentions, with the desire to serve and protect. Samuel hadn't stolen the money or abandoned it. He'd tried, in his own flawed way, to do what he thought was right. Moss carefully gathered the badge, the notebook, and the letters, placing them reverently back in the oiled cloth bag. This changed everything. What had been a question of abstract justice, town versus government, legal rights versus moral claims, was now deeply, painfully personal. His family was part of this tragedy. His grandfather had died, never knowing what happened to his brother, never knowing how close the relief money had come, never knowing that family history and town catastrophe were inextricably linked. The sun was setting when Moss finally left the hidden bowl. He carried the oiled bag with him, along with the certificate they'd selected for authentication. Tomorrow, he and Doc would leave for Kansas City, but tonight, he needed to tell Ben what he'd discovered. Tonight, he needed to share the truth that Samuel Garrett's attempt to protect Cedar Ridge's salvation had instead become the instrument of its destruction, and that the man who'd made that fateful choice was his own blood. Moss rode straight to Doc's house, bypassing the sheriff's office. When Doc opened the door, he took one look at Moss's face and called for Ben without asking questions. Within 20 minutes, all 3 men were gathered in the study, and Moss was spreading Samuel Garrett's belongings across the desk. "My grandfather's brother," Moss said, his voice hollow. "All these years, my grandfather never mentioned having a brother named Samuel, never said a word about him being involved with the ghost coach." Ben picked up the security badge, turning it over in his hands. "Federal security escort, that's a position that doesn't exist anymore. They used to assign them to high-value shipments in the territories, plainclothes guards who rode with the cargo. Samuel was trying to protect the money," Doc said, reading through the notebook. "When the driver died, he made a choice, hide the coach, come back with help. But he never made it back," Moss finished. "I found his remains near the coach. He died out there, and the secret died with him." Doc was reading the letter addressed to Jacob Garrett, Moss's grandfather. His hands trembled as he reached the end. Lord have mercy. This man carried the weight of an entire town on his shoulders, and it crushed him. "My grandfather spent his whole life obsessed with the ghost coach story," Moss said quietly. "Used to tell it over and over, trying to make sense of how something so important could just vanish. Now I understand why. He wasn't just curious about local history, he was trying to find his brother." "Did he know Samuel was the escort?" Ben asked. "I don't think so. Samuel's position was secret, and from his letter, it's clear he didn't want to implicate his brother if something went wrong." Moss picked up the letter. "Read a passage aloud. 'Do not let my failure stain your name. You were always the better man.'" He set it down carefully. "Samuel was trying to protect our family reputation, even as he was dying." The 3 men sat in heavy silence. The discovery of the ghost coach had been extraordinary enough. Learning that it carried the answer to Cedar Ridge's generational tragedy had given their mission moral weight. But now it was personal in a way that changed everything. "This makes the claims stronger," Doc finally said. "A federal security escort tried to protect the shipment. He died in the line of duty, and the money was lost, not through negligence but through tragedy. That strengthens our argument that the government failed in its responsibility. It also makes it more complicated," Ben countered. "If word gets out that Moss's family was involved, some people might say we're trying to cover up a theft. That Samuel Garrett deliberately hid the money, and we're just finishing what he started." "That's a lie," Moss said sharply. "Samuel died trying to protect it. I know that. You know that. Especially when there's this much money involved." Before anyone could respond, there was a sharp knock at Doc's door. The 3 men froze, exchanging alarmed glances. It was past 9 at night. No one should be calling at this hour. Doc rose carefully and went to the door. They heard his surprised voice, and then another voice, younger, familiar. Deputy Tom Marsh stepped into the study, his hat in his hands, his expression serious. "Evening, gentlemen. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The silence that followed was damning in its completeness. Tom looked at each of them in turn, taking in the papers spread on the desk, the tension in the room. "I followed you, Moss," Tom said quietly. "This afternoon. Watched you go to the Elder Woods, watched you come back carrying something. Then you rode straight here, and Ben showed up not 15 minutes later." He gestured at the desk. "So maybe it's time someone tells me what's really going on." Moss's first instinct was to deny everything, to protect their secret, but Ben spoke before he could. "Close the door, Tom. If you're here, you might as well know the truth." Tom did as instructed, settling into a chair with wary eyes. Ben and Moss looked at Doc, who nodded slowly. If Tom had already connected enough dots to follow them here, lies would only make things worse. So they told him everything. The discovery of the ghost coach, the gold certificates, the research into legal claims, and finally, the revelation about Samuel Garrett. Tom listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from skepticism to wonder to something deeper and more pained. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, breathing hard. "My grandmother died in the spring of 1890, he said finally. "Mary Marsh, née Henderson. She was 7 years old. Doc, you have her in your ledger. I've seen the entry. Malnutrition. Her parents lost their farm when the bank collapsed." Doc's face went pale. "Lord, Tom, I'm sorry. I didn't make the connection. How could you? I'm not a Henderson anymore," that line died out. "But my mother told me the stories. How her mother died waiting for help that never came. How the whole family fell apart after that." Tom looked at the items on the desk. "So you see, gentlemen, I have as much stake in this as any of you, maybe more." "What are you going to do?" Ben asked quietly. "You're a lawman. You have a duty to report this." "I have a duty to justice," Tom corrected. "And right now, I'm not sure those are the same thing." He leaned forward. "That money was meant to save Cedar Ridge. The government sent it. The driver died trying to deliver it, and the escort died trying to protect it. Seems to me the failure here belongs to the people who called off the search after 2 weeks, not to the men who gave their lives trying to do their jobs." "That's our argument," Doc said, "but it's not a certain win in court." "Then don't go to court yet. Authenticate the certificates first. Establish your legal foundation. Then make your move." Tom stood and walked to the desk, studying Samuel Garrett's badge. This man tried to do the right thing. He failed, but he tried. Maybe it's time someone finished what he started. "You'd help us?" Moss asked, surprised. "I'd help my town, the town my grandmother died waiting to save." Tom turned to face them. "But we have to be smart about this. Word is already spreading that something's going on. Old man Pritchard cornered me yesterday, asking why the sheriff keeps riding out to the county seat. Mrs. Chen at the general store says people are talking, wondering if there's trouble coming." "Then we need to move fast," Doc said decisively. "Moss and I leave for Kansas City tomorrow. We authenticate one certificate, establish that they're genuine and redeemable. Ben, you prepare the legal documentation for a town trust. Tom, you keep things quiet here, deflect questions, maintain normal routines." "And if someone asks outright what we're doing," Tom asked, "tell them the truth, that we're working on something that might benefit the town, but it's too early to discuss details." Ben stood, his sheriff's authority settling over him like a cloak. "We move forward, but we do it carefully. Document everything, follow every legal requirement we can think of. If this goes to court, our case has to be airtight." "What about the personal connection?" Tom asked, gesturing at Samuel Garrett's belongings. "Some people might see it as a conflict of interest." "Some people might," Moss agreed. "But the truth is the truth. Samuel Garrett died trying to protect that money. The fact that he was my family doesn't change his intentions or his sacrifice. If anything, it proves that Cedar Ridge's own people believed in the importance of that shipment. Doc gathered up Samuel's letter, the notebook, and the badge, handling them with reverence. These will be part of our documentation. Evidence that the escort didn't abandon his duty, that he died trying to fulfill it. Combined with Nathaniel Briggs's journal and the manifest, we can build a comprehensive narrative of what actually happened. They spent the next hour planning in detail. Moss and Doc would take the train to Kansas City, presenting themselves as representatives of Cedar Ridge, investigating a possible historical find. They'd approach Doc's contact at the bank, authenticate one certificate, and probe the question of redemption value without revealing the full extent of their discovery. Meanwhile, Ben would work with Tom to maintain normalcy in Cedar Ridge while preparing the legal groundwork for a community trust. They'd research state laws on abandoned property, consult with a lawyer in the county seat if necessary, and lay the foundation for a claim that could withstand scrutiny. If the certificate is authentic and redeemable, Doc said, we'll have proof that the full shipment has value. Then we move quickly to establish our claim before word spreads. And if it's not, Moss asked. Then we've lost nothing but time and train fare, Doc replied. But I don't think that's how this will go. Those certificates look genuine to me, and I handled enough territorial currency in my day to know quality when I see it. As the meeting broke up, Tom pulled Moss aside. I want you to know I'm not doing this for personal gain. If we claim that money, I don't want any special consideration. Whatever benefit comes to the town should be spread equally. Same here, Moss said. This isn't about enriching ourselves. It's about giving Cedar Ridge the future it was promised 30 years ago. And your great-uncle, Samuel Garrett? Moss looked at the oiled bag that held his relative's possessions. I'm doing this for him too. He made a mistake, chose fear over wisdom, but his intentions were good, and he died trying to make things right. Maybe this is a chance to redeem his memory along with the town. Tom nodded slowly. My grandmother would have liked that. She never got a chance at redemption, died too young, too poor, with too much suffering. But if this money can help make sure no other children die that way, then maybe her death meant something after all. The four men stood together in Doc's study, surrounded by evidence of tragedy and bound by a common purpose. Tomorrow, they would take the first real step toward claiming what had been lost. Tomorrow, they would find out if 30 years of patience could finally be rewarded, if the ghost coach's silence could be broken, if redemption was possible for the living and the dead. Outside, Cedar Ridge slept under a canopy of stars, unaware that its fate was about to change. The town that had died slowly for 3 decades might finally have a chance to live again, if they could just hold their secret long enough to see it through. The train to Kansas City left at dawn. Moss and Doc settled into their seats with the careful movements of men carrying something precious. The certificate they'd selected was wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked into Doc's medical bag, hidden among bandages and instruments where no casual thief would think to look. Doc had sent a telegram ahead, requesting a meeting with his old contact. The response had been terse but affirmative. Thursday, 2 p.m., private office. No questions asked, which was exactly what they needed. The journey took most of the day. Moss watched the landscape roll past, his mind replaying the past week's revelations over and over. From tracking a wounded elk, to discovering the ghost coach, to learning about Samuel Garrett's role, each revelation had transformed the meaning of what they were doing. "You're quiet," Doc observed. "Thinking about my grandfather, wishing I could tell him we found his brother, that we know what happened. Maybe he knows anyway. If there's anything beyond this life, I imagine he's watching, hoping we can finish what Samuel couldn't. You believe in that? An afterlife?" Doc smiled faintly. "At 85, I'd better. But yes, I've seen too much unexplainable kindness, too much suffering that leads to growth, to believe this is all there is. Your grandfather, my father, all the people in my ledger who died too soon, they deserve better than just ending. Maybe this is our chance to honor them." They arrived in Kansas City as the afternoon light was turning golden. The city was everything Cedar Ridge wasn't: busy, prosperous, alive with possibility. Moss felt out of place in his worn trail clothes, but Doc moved through the crowds with easy confidence, born of his years as a territorial councilman. The bank was an imposing stone building in the financial district. They were shown to a private office on the third floor, where a man in his 70s waited behind a mahogany desk. "Doc Harlon," the man said warmly, standing to shake hands. "It's been too many years." "Samuel, good to see you. This is Jedidiah Thorne from Cedar Ridge. Moss, meet Samuel Whitmore. We served together on the Territorial Council back in the 80s. Whitmore shook Moss's hand with a firm grip, then gestured for them to sit. "Your telegram was intriguing. You've discovered something of potential value and need authentication. I assume this relates to your mention of 1890. "It does," Doc said. He glanced at the door, which Whitmore had closed behind them. "What we're about to show you needs to remain confidential. Can we count on your discretion? You have my word, and as a private banker, I'm bound by client confidentiality, regardless." Doc carefully unwrapped the certificate and laid it on Whitmore's desk. The banker's eyebrows rose immediately. He reached for a magnifying glass and a small lamp, examining the document with practiced precision. "Gold certificate, series of 1890, Whitmore murmured. $50 denomination, issued by the U.S. Treasury." He spent several minutes examining the paper, the ink, the serial numbers, making notes in a small book. Finally, he looked up. "Where did you get this?" "We found it," Moss said, "along with documentation showing it was part of a federal relief shipment that went missing 30 years ago." "The ghost coach." Whitmore sat back in his chair, understanding dawning on his face. "Lord, I remember hearing about that. The shipment that vanished during the panic. Everyone assumed it was lost forever." "It wasn't lost," Doc said. "It was hidden by accident, and we've found it. But we need to know, is that certificate authentic? And more importantly, is it still redeemable?" Whitmore examined the certificate again, this time with even more care. He pulled out reference books, compared serial numbers against government records he kept in his office safe, tested the paper with chemicals Moss didn't recognize. Finally, after nearly an hour, Whitmore set down his instruments and looked at them directly. "It's authentic. No question. The paper, the printing, the serial numbers, all genuine Treasury issue from 1890. He paused. "And yes, it's still redeemable. Gold certificates of this series can be exchanged for their face value in gold or equivalent currency, though the actual redemption process is complicated." Moss felt his breath catch. "How much would it be worth?" "Face value is $50 in 1890 currency. In today's terms, accounting for gold standard changes and currency revaluation," Whitmore made quick calculations. "Approximately $800, modern currency. But that's conservative. Some collectors would pay significantly more for certificates in this condition." "And if there were more of them?" Doc asked carefully. "Hypothetically?" Whitmore studied them for a long moment. "How many more are we talking about, hypothetically?" 42 crates. Thousands of certificates." The banker went very still. "The full shipment? You found the entire ghost coach cargo?" "We did." Whitmore stood and walked to his window, looking out at the Kansas City skyline. When he turned back, his expression was serious. "Gentlemen, if you try to redeem thousands of 1890 gold certificates through standard Treasury channels, you'll attract immediate federal attention. There will be investigations, legal challenges, questions about ownership and provenance. The government may try to seize the entire lot as lost federal property." "We know," Doc said. "That's why we came to you. We need a strategy that protects our claim while establishing the certificate's value." "You need time," Whitmore said. "Time to build your legal case before anyone realizes what you've found." He returned to his desk, making notes. "I can help with gradual redemption through private banking channels. Small batches, different institutions, spread over time. It'll take longer, but it won't raise red flags." "How long?" "For the full amount? Years, probably." But you could establish proof of value fairly quickly, redeem enough to demonstrate the certificates are genuine, and negotiate from a position of strength. Moss and Doc exchanged glances. Years wasn't ideal, but it was better than losing everything to federal seizure. "What do we do first?" Moss asked. Whitmore smiled. "First, you let me keep this certificate as a sample. I'll begin quiet negotiations with several private institutions, establish redemption channels. Meanwhile, you need to build your legal claim, hire lawyers, research ownership law, prepare documentation. When you're ready to go public, you'll have both financial proof and legal standing. And you'll help us? Doc Harlon, you saved my daughter's life when she was 6 years old. Diphtheria, if I remember correctly. I've owed you a debt for 25 years. Whitmore extended his hand. Consider it paid. As they left the bank, Moss felt something shift in his chest. The certificate was authentic. The shipment had value. What they'd found could actually save Cedar Ridge if they could navigate the legal maze ahead. "We did it," Doc said quietly as they walked through the evening streets. "First step complete." "Now comes the hard part," Moss replied. "Making sure we can keep it." The telegram reached Cedar Ridge before Moss and Doc did. Authentic, proceeding, return Monday. Ben read it 3 times, then showed it to Tom. They looked at each other in silent acknowledgement. This was really happening. The ghost coach wasn't just a legend anymore. It was salvation, waiting to be claimed. By the time Moss and Doc stepped off the train Monday evening, Ben had everything prepared. The town hall, rarely used for anything these days, except storage, had been cleaned and set up for a meeting. Every adult resident of Cedar Ridge had received a handwritten notice. Emergency town meeting, Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock. Attendance mandatory. Subject, Cedar Ridge's future. The curiosity and speculation that generated was exactly what Ben wanted. Let them wonder. Let them gather. The truth would be better delivered to everyone at once. Tuesday evening arrived cold and clear. By 6:30, the town hall was packed with nearly every adult in Cedar Ridge, maybe 200 people total, a stark reminder of how far the population had fallen. They sat in folding chairs or stood against the walls, murmuring amongst themselves, casting curious glances at the 3 men seated at the front. Sheriff Ben Coulter, Doc Harlon, and Jedidiah Moss Thorne. At precisely 7, Ben stood and called the meeting to order. The murmuring died slowly, replaced by expectant silence. "Thank you all for coming," Ben began. "What we're about to tell you will sound impossible. Some of you may not believe it at first, but I ask you to listen completely before you react, because what we've discovered could change everything for Cedar Ridge." He nodded to Moss, who stood with his grandfather's compass in his hand, a talisman, a connection to the past they were about to honor. "2 weeks ago," Moss said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet hall, "I was tracking a wounded elk into the elder woods. I found something I wasn't looking for." He paused. "I found the ghost coach." The reaction was immediate gasps, disbelieving laughter, people turning to their neighbors in confusion. Ben let it run its course before raising his hand for silence. "It's true," Ben confirmed. "We have photographs, documentation, physical evidence. The Overland Express coach that vanished in February of 1890 has been sitting in a hidden ravine in the Elder Woods for 30 years. "And the money?" someone called out. Old man Pritchard, his voice sharp despite his confused mind. "The relief money?" "Still there," Doc said, standing slowly. 42 crates of gold certificates from the U.S. Mint. We've had one authenticated by a private banker in Kansas City. They're genuine, and they're still redeemable." The hall erupted. People stood, shouting questions, arguing amongst themselves. Mrs. Chen was crying. Others looked stunned, unable to process what they were hearing. Ben whistled sharply, the kind of whistle that could stop a bar fight. "Everyone sit down. We'll explain everything, but you need to listen." Slowly, order returned. Doc opened his medical ledger and began to read the entries from 1,890. the names of the dead, the documentation of suffering. His voice never wavered, but tears ran freely down his weathered face as he honored the memory of everyone who died waiting for help that never came. When he finished, the silence was profound. People wept openly. Others stared at their hands at the floor, processing 30 years of loss and the sudden possibility that it might finally mean something. The money was meant to save Cedar Ridge, Ben said into that silence. The government sent it, and the government failed to deliver it. Now, we have a chance to claim what was always meant to be ours, but we have to do it right, as a community, with everyone sharing equally. He explained the legal framework they'd developed, a community trust that would manage the gradual redemption of the certificates. Every adult resident would be a beneficiary. The money would go toward rebuilding, a new school, a functioning bank, assistance for failing businesses, infrastructure repairs. This isn't about making anyone rich, Ben said firmly. It's about giving Cedar Ridge a future, the future we were promised 30 years ago. Then Moss stood again, holding Samuel Garrett's badge. There's something else you need to know. He told them about his great-uncle, about the choice Samuel had made, about his death trying to protect the shipment. He made a mistake, Moss said quietly. Fear and pride led him to hide the coach instead of seeking help immediately. That decision cost Cedar Ridge dearly. It cost my grandfather a brother he never spoke of again. But Samuel Garrett died trying to do his duty, and I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive him. Mrs. Chen stood, her voice shaking but clear. My parents lost everything in the collapse. My father died of despair, but I don't blame Samuel Garrett. He tried. He died trying. That's more than the government ever did for us. Others nodded. Old man Pritchard, lucid for once, spoke up. Boy tried to do right, just ran out of time. Ain't his fault the searchers gave up. One by one, people stood to speak. Not all were forgiving. There was anger, resentment, old wounds reopening. But the dominant sentiment was clear. Samuel Garrett had been human, flawed, trying his best in an impossible situation. And now, 3 decades later, his family was giving them a chance to reclaim what had been lost. Ben produced the trust charter he and Tom had prepared. It laid out the framework for managing the discovery: equal distribution of benefits, transparent accounting, community oversight. Every adult resident would sign it, making them all partners in Cedar Ridge's salvation. The signing took hours. People lined up, some with hands that shook, others with tears in their eyes. They signed their names to a document that promised hope, that said their town mattered, that their suffering had not been meaningless. When the last signature was added, Mrs. Chen's shaky script at the bottom of the final page, Ben held up the charter. This is our future, he said. All of us, together. Cedar Ridge isn't dead, not anymore. The applause started slowly, then built into something fierce and joyful. People embraced, wept, laughed. The town hall filled with noise and light, and the first real hope Cedar Ridge had felt in 30 years. Moss stood to the side, watching his neighbors celebrate. He thought about his grandfather, about Samuel Garrett, about Nathaniel Briggs, and all the people who died believing they'd failed. They hadn't failed. They'd just needed time, 30 years of time, for their efforts to bear fruit. The healing had begun. 6 months later, Moss stood in the hidden bowl where the ghost coach still rested, though now it looked different. The vines had been carefully trimmed back, and a simple wooden fence protected the site from weather and wildlife. The crates had been removed, documented, and secured. What remained was a monument to persistence, to tragedy, and ultimately to redemption. At the base of a nearby tree, a new marker stood, a simple stone engraved with words Moss had chosen carefully. In memory of Samuel Garrett and Nathaniel Briggs, may their burden be lifted. Moss ran his hand over the stone, feeling its cool smoothness. His great-uncle's remains had been given a proper burial in Cedar Ridge Cemetery, next to Moss's grandfather. Brothers reunited after 30 years of separation. The funeral had been well attended, the town turning out to honor the man who'd tried to save them. "Thought I'd find you here." Moss turned to see Ben picking his way through the gap in the ravine wall. His friend looked different these days, lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally lifted. "Needed to check on things," Moss said. "Make sure the site's being preserved properly. The Historical Society's doing good work. They've already had 3 archaeology teams request permission to study it." Ben joined him by the memorial stone. "Hard to believe it's only been 6 months. It did feel longer." Cedar Ridge had transformed in ways that still caught Moss by surprise. The new school was half-built, its frame rising against the sky like a promise. The bank had reopened, staffed by young professionals brought in from Billings. Main Street had 6 new businesses, and there was talk of a 7th opening before winter. Most remarkably, families were returning. Young couples who'd left years ago were coming back, bringing children with them, drawn by jobs and opportunity and the chance to rebuild their hometown. The population had grown by nearly 100 people, and more were expected in the spring. "Tom's doing well in his new role," Ben said, changing the subject with the casualness of a man who'd learned to read Moss's silences. Deputy Marsh had been promoted to full sheriff when Ben accepted a position as regional marshal, overseeing law enforcement across 3 counties. It was the kind of opportunity that would never have existed in the old Cedar Ridge. "He's a good man. He'll serve the town well. Better than I did, probably. He's got energy I never had at his age." Moss smiled faintly. "You did just fine. Your father would be proud." "I hope so." Ben touched the memorial stone. "We're naming the new community center after him, the Coulter Center. Figure it's a way to honor all the people who kept searching, even when it seemed hopeless." They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 old friends who'd been through something extraordinary and come out the other side, changed. The burden they'd carried for weeks, the secret, the fear, the weight of responsibility, had been shared with the town and thereby lightened. "Doc's throwing a party this Saturday," Ben said. "Celebration of the school's progress. He specifically asked me to make sure you come." "I'll be there. He's been different lately. Happier. Says he's finally seen the thing he'd given up hoping for Cedar Ridge with a future." Moss nodded. Doc Harlon had wept openly at the school's groundbreaking ceremony, and no one had thought less of him for it. At 85, he was seeing the town he'd served his entire life come back to life. What greater gift could a man ask for? As Ben prepared to leave, Moss called him back. He reached into his vest and pulled out his grandfather's compass, the brass worn smooth from decades of handling. "I want you to give this to Tom," Moss said. "Tell him it's from his grandmother, in a way. Tell him to remember that true north lies within." Ben took the compass carefully, understanding what the gesture meant. "You sure?" "I'm sure. Tom represents Cedar Ridge's future. He should have something that connects him to its past." Moss smiled. "Besides, I don't need it anymore. I finally found what I was looking for." After Ben left, Moss remained in the hidden bowl as afternoon faded toward evening. He thought about his grandfather, who'd told stories of the ghost coach without ever knowing his brother's role in the tragedy. He thought about Samuel Garrett, who'd made an impossible choice and paid for it with his life. He thought about Nathaniel Briggs, who'd simply been trying to do his job and support his family. All of them caught up in circumstances beyond their control, all of them trying their best, all of them deserving to be remembered with compassion rather than judgment. What we've lost shapes us more than what we find that had been true at the beginning of this journey. But now Moss understood the completion of that thought. What we find can heal what we've lost if we're willing to do the hard work of redemption. As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Moss made his way out of the ravine and back toward town. From the ridge above the elder woods, he could see Cedar Ridge spread below him, lights coming on in homes old and new, smoke rising from chimneys, the skeletal frame of the school silhouetted against the fading light. It wasn't the Cedar Ridge of his youth, prosperous and full of hope. It might never be that again. But it was alive, It had a future. Children would grow up here, learn in that new school, build lives and families and dreams. That was enough. More than enough. Moss descended toward town as stars began to appear overhead. In his pocket, where the compass had rested for so many years, he now carried Samuel Garrett's badge, a reminder of human frailty, human courage, and the long path between failure and redemption. Sometimes what we've lost has to be found before healing can begin. Sometimes the answer to a question takes 30 years to arrive. And sometimes, if we're patient enough and brave enough and willing to do what's right, even when it's hard, we get the chance to finish what others started. Cedar Ridge had that chance now. Moss had helped give it to them, with the guidance of friends and the discovery of a ghost coach that had never really been lost, just waiting patiently for the right person to find it at the right time. As he walked through town toward home, Moss allowed himself a moment of peace. His grandfather could rest now. Samuel Garrett could rest. All the names in Doc's ledger could rest. The burden had been lifted. The future had begun. And for the first time in 30 years, Cedar Ridge looked forward instead of back.